You're good to go.
In person and at home live event. This is the second time we've done this, so we're still getting used to doing all of this. Hi, I'm Christine von Kallnitz. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of the local Lunz Group Sierra Club. And thank you to everyone at home for coming as well, and thank you for all making it downtown. So Robert Lunz Group Sierra Club, we've been around for a long time. I don't even know when we were created, but we've got 1,200 members in Berkeley, Charleston, Colleton, and Dorchester counties. And our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. All right, so the leadership, I already introduced myself. Laura's in the audience. She is, she's our publicity chair. And Pat Luck, I know she's at home tonight. She wasn't feeling too great. Star, he's at home tonight. He's running the behind the scenes IT. Nina Fair's in the audience. She's just back from a Western adventure and having fun on the Green River. And Bill Turner, he's not on the leadership, but he is an outings leader. So thank you for coming. He's in the room. And by the way, we have elections coming up. So if you want to join our leadership team, let me know. We have 3 seats to fill. I know Star and I are running again for re-election. So if you're a member and you see an email come through, give us a vote. All right, outings. And Star at home is going to talk about these outings.
Well, I should be able to wind it up in about 35 minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah.
We will go down to the on-off passage of the Palmetto Trail. Now, given the recent near hurricane, I'll have to hike and find what's passable, and I will report. On the 27th, I think this trip is actually full right now. The trip to visit the Nemours Wildlife Plantation in the 8th Basin. You can sign up, and if there's someone who withdraws, then I can allow you in. The limitation to people is the size of the truck that they're going to drive us around in. And again, this is on a Thursday. It's not on here right now, but just after the first of the month, we will have an outings leader trainings weekend, which you all, if you're interested at all, contact me and I'll be happy to tell you all about it. And Bill Turner is going to lead a fabulous trip on the Combahee River in the middle of November. I forget the date offhand. And that promises to be one of the great experiences of your life. So stay tuned. And if you're planning ahead and want to take a wilderness first aid class, we have one of those coming up in March of 2023. So lots going on in the outdoors, and you're welcome to join us.
Yeah, so Bill and Star have been outings leaders for quite some time, and I was an outings leader. I led one outing, then I got too involved doing other things, but it's fun. So, you know, if anybody wants to be an outings leader, let us know, and you can get out there with a whole bunch of people and take them to really great places and enjoy yourself. All right, so next month, we are going to have Jenny Brennan from the Southern Environmental Law Center. She's going to be talking to us about a new interactive tool for climate advocacy. It's they're developing this tool that shows the current and future development decisions that will affect communities and natural resources as seas keep rising, and how you can use it for climate advocacy. So, you know, especially with current hurricane we just had, we have a lot of threats from water locally. I remember the last meeting we had here last month. It took me a half an hour just to get down Calhoun Street to get to this building from the USC. So, you know, it's the water's coming, and we have to mitigate and we have to adapt to it. So, you know, let's hear what SELC has up their sleeves, and hopefully we can get some good information out of that. All right. I kind of threw this in there just on a whim, since, you know, Alec and Christina are talking about the recycling this evening. Just wanted to explain a little bit about circular or regenerative economies. Cradle to grave is another way of thinking about this. There's also something called the donut economy, just, you know, again, just the circle. It requires considering reuse in much longer timescales. Think if you're building today, how would you reuse that building in 50 years or 100 years when you might want to tear it down? So two main tenets are, you know, we've got a planet that has limited resources and has a rapidly warming climate. And resources just through things out.
You want to talk with me?
So someone at home is, we need to get people muted.
Oh.
I can do that. I know my way around the computer. So, yeah, so recycling, you know, we all know about recycling, and that retrieves the value from some household trash right now. But recently, the approach has started to gain a toehold in industries like fashion, secondhand retailers, clothing rental services, and in food production with compostable packaging. So recycling means a lot of different things now. It's very different. And then products should be designed with reuse in mind. So forethought that would require companies to rethink their businesses in most basic ways. So what Alec and Christina are coming up. Alec is a senior advisor with Bush Systems and National Recycling Coalition board member. Bush Systems makes recycling bins, and it's a company in Canada. And Cooley&Moskos is the program manager for Charleston County Environmental Management. They're going to be telling us why recycling is more relevant than ever, what's changed in recycling, what's the science behind recycling, is it still better than landfilling? You know, there's been a lot of questions about that. People can make even more of a difference by changing how they consume items. That's what we're going to hear about, like that circular economy. And Charleston County has a new state-of-the-art sorting facility, which we're going to see and hear more about. So step right up. Welcome. I'm going to stop sharing this. Okay.
So the microphone in this area.
Star, you can hear us pretty well, right?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you both, yes.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start off, and then I'll bring up Christina in a few minutes to talk about what's happening on the Charleston County level. But to start off, I did a presentation for the Lunz group right before the pandemic started back in 2018, and walked through a lot of sort of the granular level about how the recycling industry works. There's a lot of complexities to it. There's a lot of different aspects from public sector to private enterprise to a lot of behavior that's involved. So there are a lot of different things that influence it. And let's be honest, there's a huge amount of confusion and just that the complexity creates. With today's presentation, I don't want to just rehash what I did last time. So what I'm going to do is sort of break this up into three different pieces. Quickly talk about some of the big high-level things that have been happening in the industry in recent years to give some context. Talk about and then pivot and talk about more about how it is just one piece of a much larger issue about how we consume materials and talk about some of the aspects of what drives actual impact on the environment. Where do we actually make a difference? And then we'll come back at the end and we'll dive into some of the basic questions about what is recyclable, answer any questions that folks have, and do that. So
Right.
you have all been hearing headlines and stories over the last 3-4 years, high level. You've all heard about China in some vague way, that China no longer wants our stuff. This is 2018. And high level, what's been happening, you've also been hearing about stories about contamination, about the wrong things getting into recycling bins. To distill 20 years of recycling history down into 60 seconds, we used to collect everything and we used to handle it separately. You may recall we used to have tubs where you put your plastic into one tub, you put your glass into another. We call that a source separated system. And what that did is it allowed stuff to stay pretty clean. Everything was separated when it was collected. There was also a pretty inefficient system. And so over the last 20 years, we've shifted over in most locations around the country to the system we now use the term single stream or mixed recycling, where we put it all into the blue tub. It's much more efficient because it's one truck. And so that lowers costs. It's less resources to actually do the collection. So there's a lot of compelling reasons to do that. It also makes it more convenient. You don't have to think as much about sorting. And so we've seen the quantity of material that's actually collected and recycled go up dramatically in recent years. So that's the plus side. The negative side is once we started saying, just put it all in the blue tub, people took us literally. And so that's led to a lot of unintended consequences that we as an industry have been grappling with ever since. So as I said, recycling is very complex, especially when we start talking about plastics, and we'll get into some of these details later. But we also know that there's only so much bandwidth that any human person has to focus. Well, we don't want to go out and have to get a PhD in recycling to be able to do the very basic things. I've been working in this for 30 years. I still get confused about some aspects of this. So I want to, first of all, validate that it's not easy, but there are some high-level guidelines and guardrails that we can talk about as we move along. So the problem is that this contamination has caused all this material to get into the recycling stream, and at the same time that we've shifted towards this more efficient collection system, we've also offshored a lot of our manufacturing, all kinds of manufacturing. Obviously, we're all familiar with how that's moved to China and Southeast Asia and other areas. Same things happen with recyclables. For many years, the #1 export from the state of California was scrap paper. It was all going to China. The problem is all that stuff is now full of contamination, and China finally got to the point where we just don't want it anymore. And they've been building it for a number of years. And so in 2018, they called their national sword policy no more. They cut it off. And so all that material all of a sudden had to go somewhere else. And it's taken 3 or so years for the market forces, because there's a whole supply and demand, pork bellies, the same dynamic of supply and demand kicks in here. And when your giant market all of a sudden closes the door, all that material that's been going there now has to go somewhere else. So that had a boomerang effect where all of a sudden there were not enough people who wanted to buy it, all that scrap material, and started backing up and started stockpiling at warehouses. And especially the stuff that was really contaminated, nobody wanted to buy. That meant the price went down dramatically. So now you get to a local level, and Christina can talk to this a little bit more when she gets to talk and talks about from the Charleston County perspective, but it's something that's replicated across the country. The economics of how you run a program are partially driven by the revenue, the material that you sell. And so when nobody wants to buy that anymore, you have to figure out how to pay for your program. So the ripple effect of that has been that a lot of programs around 2019 started cutting back and saying, we're going to have to shut down our program altogether, or maybe we're going to stop accepting glass or other certain materials because it's not economic. This is, again, a dynamic that happened across the country. Simultaneously, you probably also started hearing stories about, well, we have all these problems with marine debris, plastics getting into the oceans. Another issue, it's another sort of parallel dynamic that's been building up in recent years. A lot of these stories have sort of been conflated. There were a lot of headlines that you also heard, stories in the New York Times, Frontline, NPR. There was a story in the Atlantic just a couple months back talking about, does recycling even make sense in the first place? Does it actually benefit the environment? we generate all this plastic and only a small percentage of it actually gets recycled, is recycling more of a greenwashing, just making us feel good about something, or is it actually having an impact? And so that's what I'll be getting into a little bit more as we come along this evening. So again, I'm giving you sort of the high level version of this because for the time we have, I want to be able to focus a little bit more on what we could be doing as individuals going forward. But we're now fast forward to 2022, and a lot of the things that if you work within the industry, you've seen this cycle happen before, and the market forces have sort of evened out in a lot of ways. China no longer wants most of our material, but there are a lot of other places that still do, because we all still consume things, and you still have to make that out of something. And so you've seen a number of different forces happening. One, some of that manufacturing that moved over to Asia has actually come back to the United States. You've actually seen Chinese companies that have come up to the United States and have invested in building facilities in the United States to take that scrap material that comes baled up, the old bottles that are scrunched up. They've been building facilities in the United States to clean that material and shred it down into it's a feedstock material, and then they put it on the ship, and then they send it to China, because they're still going to manufacture the widgets and the plastic doodads and other things in China. But the Chinese ban wasn't banning feedstock; it was simply banning the raw scrap material that was so dirty. So that's part of the dynamic. You've also seen that manufacturing has shifted to other areas in Southeast Asia. A lot of us moved to India, Vietnam, other countries. So there's been a 3-4 year period of sort of those market forces sort of settling out and readjusting. But at the end of the day, we are still consuming things in this country. We've all heard about the supply chain issues. So there's still a demand for this material. The value has gone up. It actually, as of probably 9-10 months ago, it was reaching an all-time high for certain materials. It had a higher value than they'd ever had. We're now going through a whole other round of market drops that have, I think, other forces related to the economy and inflation all have been kicking in. But so that's an important thing to know, is that in general, the economics of recycling has stabilized and improved dramatically, and you're starting to see some of the programs that were canceled are coming back online in a lot of communities. Contamination is still a huge issue, and it's not something that's going to go away in the near term. It's also something we have to become much more conscious of as a long term, at least trying to understand the very basics about how to do that sorting. Again, we'll dive into that a little bit more and further on. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Christina and let her talk a little bit more just about what's happening here, specifically in Charleston County.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. Hi. So I won't speak too much because I know Alec has some great information to share with y'all, so I don't want to take up too much of his time. But being a representative of Charleston County, I do just want to thank everyone here for participating in the recycling program, and hopefully, fingers crossed, participating correctly, because that really is the key for us currently. You know, Alec mentioned contamination, and we'll talk more about that, but we're at a point in our program where everyone kind of knows what recycling is. They know that participation is important, but that's really not enough. We need you to participate correctly. So our education right now is really encouraging people to only include a very short list of items in their recycling cart. And those are your standard household recyclable items like paper and paperboard, flattened cardboard, plastic bottles and containers, glass bottles and jars, and aluminum, steel, tin, metal cans. If it's not one of those things, don't even guess about it. Just don't put it in your recycling cart. So I will say Charleston County's single stream recycling program, which, as Alec mentioned, a lot of great positive things. It doubled our tonnage that we were bringing into the recycling center and more than doubled our participation rate. So fabulous things. However, it very much upped our contamination rate. That program just turned 10 years old, which is kind of crazy. But in that 10 years, we've really tried to make changes with our education to try to make it as simple as possible for people. We made it really easy to recycle, and we need to make it really easy to kind of understand what items go in to the blue cart and why. So within those past 10 years, I'm sure some of you know, it hasn't been smooth sailing for recycling in Charleston County. We tried for years and years to complete our new MRF, which finally opened at the end of 2020. We had some challenges with our old processing facility on Romney Street, the population growth and the expanded tonnage that the single street program created. Basically, Romney Street couldn't keep up. So there were plans in place for years and years and years to build this recycling facility, kept getting pushed to the side. It didn't happen. We partnered with various counties and municipalities in our Low Country area. For a while, we were sending recycled material to Horry County so that they could process it for us. At one point, that contract ended. We were getting ready to send material to Repower, Berkeley County, so that they could process material for us, all while we're waiting for the new facility to be completed. And unfortunately, there were times where material had to be landfilled. At a certain point, there was a little gap in between the contracts. We tried to save material at the Beesbury landfill. I think that's when a lot of rumors got started that Charleston County was landfilling material, because what was happening is trucks were going to the Beesbury landfill, a site adjacent to the landfill, dropping the recyclable items there. The hope was that we would hold it for 2 weeks until Repower opened. But unfortunately, the material became degraded by sunlight and rain, and it ultimately had to be landfilled. People ask me all the time, is Charleston County landfilling recyclable material? With the exception of that time period, which was just because of contracts not lining up. The short answer is that yes, some material that comes to Charleston County's recycling facility does have to be landfilled, but it's, again, those contamination items, those items that people give us in their blue recycling carts that are not accepted and that we can't do anything with at the recycling center. So keep that in mind the next time you're sort of trying to, guess if something should go in the blue cart or not. So briefly, I think the next slide is the next slide video. So again, we did finally open the new Charleston County Material Recovery Facility, commonly called MRF, at the end of 2020. It is a brand new state-of-the-art facility. It's about 82,000 square feet, and a huge bulk of that, about 65,000 square feet, is processing space. That is where any and all recyclable material collected in Charleston County's recycling programs comes to be processed and separated, sorted according to type, baled, and then marketed and sold to remanufacturers. The facility, and I have a brief video I can show you guys, so I won't give you too much detail, but the facility, like I mentioned, is state-of-the-art. It can process up to 25 tons of material each hour. So to put that in perspective, our old facility on Romney Street could process about 5 tons an hour on a really great day, maybe 6. So we've definitely increased what we can do at this facility, as well as the equipment that we have there. It just makes the separation of the material so much easier. It's able to capture a lot of material that our old facility could not. So with that, I will give you guys a quick overview video of the recycling center. Larger.
Welcome to the Charleston County Material Recovery Facility, or commonly referred to as a MRF. This is one of the most advanced in the Southeast. The facility is owned by Charleston County and operated by Charleston Recycling Services. It's 82,000 square feet and can process 25 tons per hour. Recycling is a system of collecting and processing materials and turning them into new products. So how does it all work here? The process starts curbside with the blue cart, and our fleet collects and brings all the material here to the MRF. Drivers weigh in and dump on the tipping floor. A loader drops the material into a Matheson, where it begins its journey to the processing area. Contamination is the main threat to recycling, and this team of hand sorters is the first line of defense, disposing of non-recyclables before they can get to the next step in the system. After pre-sort, each step of material finds its way around with the help of some state-of-the-art equipment. Cardboard and fiber go one way, plastic, glass, and metal containers go another way. Magnets pull metals out of the container line. 3 robots each conduct 80 picks per minute to help remove contaminants from the fiber line. 3 optical sorters help to clear out material out of the plastic line. Finally, the material moves over an eddy current to pull out any remaining aluminum. At the end of the line, the specific types of recyclables are baled together and loaded out to a truck. Their next stop is another processing facility where they turn into recycled content products.
Okay, so yeah, just a real brief overview of what happens at the recycling facility. The main takeaway here is that contamination can truly be detrimental. Not only can it, harm the value of the recyclables that we are marketing and selling, but it can also cause huge processing issues, worker safety issues. So we are really pushing to avoid contamination for those reasons. Again, this facility is very state of the art. It's using optics and artificial intelligence, but a lot of the sorting is still done by hand. So, that's another kind of worker safety issue. We want to make sure that something that could, cause a problem doesn't come through the line and harm the worker. With that being said, I do want to speak about convenience center locations. That's another big piece to Charleston County's, diversion and recycling programs. We have 8 staffed convenience centers located throughout Charleston County. Again, if you live in a neighboring county, you want to check with your specific county for their kind of rules and regulations. But we do have these staffed convenience centers for those items that, while they're not accepted in your blue recycling cart at the curb, they might be able to be given another life through recycling. Things like batteries and paint, electronic waste like TVs, printers, monitors, computers, light bulbs, used motor oil, things like that are all accepted at Charleston County's convenience centers. And if you guys have any questions about what's accepted, happy to talk about that later on. But I will turn it back over to Alex so that he can talk more about specific contamination, why it's so detrimental, and things that we do want to see in the recycling parts.
As Christina alluded to, I actually tried doing this.
Do you want me in there?
Household
You
hazardous
want me
waste.
in there? Okay, I'm watching something on my computer. I think I'm.
You got that? But you can, if you're outside of Charleston County, Dorchester and Berkeley both have websites that will give you the exact addresses for their respective convenience centers are, what exactly you can take to those locations. So high level, just want to talk about what happens to recyclables, because this is a big question that a lot of people have. We're used to sort of the traditional, you throw things away. That's how we manage things as trash. It magically just disappears once you put it into a bin. And it's important to know what things get turned into. One of the things that we've been seeing over the last 3 years, and there's actually been national surveying data that showed us that there's a growing percentage of people who have also kind of had that same skepticism that it actually is getting recycled in the first place. You see a story about it went to the landfill, or you've seen a trash truck go down the streets and it picked up the blue carts. And so there's a lot of folks who had that confusion, but recycling gets turned into very specific things, and there is a definite demand for these materials, and it's concrete. With paper, it could be any sort of things. It's back into other the same types of products. Increasingly, you're seeing paper used more to do tissues and paper towels and those kinds of materials. Metals, all the whole range of things. If it's made out of metal, it can be made out of recycled material to begin with. In many cases, it's being turned back into new steel cans, new aluminum cans, but it can also be made to make airplanes. The steel of the support wires for the river bridge have recycled content. So you see that all types of materials, oftentimes, especially with metals, it's not necessarily labeled. You will never know that it's recycled content, but it's ubiquitous enough that it simply is being mixed in to those items. Plastics as well can be turned into all sorts of things. Take just PET, your traditional soda drink bottle. That material can be turned into new bottles. It can be turned into carpet. It can be turned into all different types of items. Increasingly, you're seeing in the automotive industry, just the plastics, the dashboard and other things are being made out of recycled plastic, scrap materials, benches. So there's a whole range of things that it can be turned into back end. Likewise with glass. Glass is a little bit harder. Folks are probably most familiar with glass being something that's not being accepted in a lot of locations now. And part of the reason for that is comes down to economics. You've got to be able to sell it and make enough money to pay for the program. The problem with glass is it's so heavy that to ship it a long distance makes it uneconomical. So it's in a closer range. You've got to find a way of finding a market for it locally to make that economical. We're lucky here in Charleston, or in the Low Country. There's actually a new company that I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. This based down in Beaufort that's using this new technology where you actually, it's called a foam glass, where you blow what type of gas into molten glass. You melt it down, you pull these gases into it, and you can use it to make architectural features, things that have incredible strength that you can actually be load bearing and simultaneously have a really pretty aesthetic. This image right here in the middle is an example of what they produce. And that's a brand new company that's just starting up, that's again able to take glass here locally. There are more exciting things about that in the near future. So let's start talking, shifting a little bit more into the why. Where is the actual value? And try to separate some of the fact from fiction. The first thing to know is that there's a huge economic value to recycling. It's expanded in many ways. If you go back 30 years, recycling really was just a very simple cans and bottles. It was a few number of things, and the number of things you could turn it into was relatively small. It's grown dramatically over the last 3 decades, so that it's become a huge economic force, both in the United States and also internationally. Some really important things to know is when you take something, you send it to the landfill, the job that takes to handle that, to drive the truck up there, dump it, take the big machines that cover it up, are just 1/10 the number of jobs. If you take that same amount of material, that same ton of waste, and you take it and you recycle it, you create 10 times as many jobs, because there's that whole manufacturing process that you're able to generate with that material. So within the US, you can see here, recycling generates close to 800,000 jobs in this country, and generates $36.6 billion in wages, has a huge impact on tax revenue. In South Carolina, we have a lot of businesses here that are taking scrap materials and generating private industry jobs here. According to South Carolina's Department of Commerce, there's over 300 businesses supporting over 54,000 jobs here in South Carolina. You can see the stats on this, the capital improvement, that $1.71 billion in capital improvement is just in the last 3 years. As I pointed to, how there are Chinese companies and others who are investing in creating new manufacturing capacity in the United States. That's what that 1.71 represents, just in the last 3 years. New development here in South Carolina with companies that are taking plastic and making new materials out of it. Just a quick here, there's a couple examples to put a face to some of these companies. I alluded to a moment ago, this company Glassworks that's down in Beaufort County that's creating foam glass. That investment was $15 million just to build that facility, and they're generating 45 plus jobs. Sunoco, we're all very familiar with. They're based here in Hartsville. They just upgraded their cardboard, paperboard recycling facility in Hartsville that is generating hundreds of new jobs and handling tons of material that in the past, in many cases, was going to China. And so that's more manufacturing that's happening here now. And then this on the right side is an example of a Chinese company, Greatech Environment, that in the past was taking the scrap material, receiving in China and cleaning it up and then turning it into feedstock. They shifted their operation to Alabama, where they now take scrap HDPE, old milk jugs and all. They clean it up, they're creating feedstock that then gets shipped and used elsewhere. So I point all these out because it's important to know that when you recycle, when you participate, you are just the first step in that whole process. You are contributing. None of this economic activity is possible without the effort that each one of us makes every time we toss something into a recycling bin. You are supporting that process. So here's where it gets a little thornier. Let's talk about where the environmental value is. Just on a very high level stats, this is the stat here is from the US EPA. Just in 2018, the cumulative efforts of recycling in the US was able to prevent 193 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that otherwise would have been generated if not for recycling. The question is, where does that happen? How exactly does it produce that? And I'll come back to that point in just one moment. But there are some very significant issues that still remain that are very legitimate that you've heard about that we need to address. One is the contamination, obviously. When you have contamination, that requires more effort to pull that out. It requires energy. In some cases, it does mean some material has to be thrown out. It does have to go to the landfill. That raises not only the cost of recycling, it also lowers the environmental value of it because it's taking more effort to clean it up. And so in some cases where recycling would make environmental, would have a tangible benefit, it actually reduces your greenhouse gas emissions. If it takes more effort, more energy to clean it up, that increases the amount of energy you're consuming to get it done, and it actually negates the benefits of that. And it can end up being a worse alternative than actually just throwing it directly in the landfill, because you're now consuming more resources just to get it clean. So
What are you talking about when you say contaminants? I mean, in this business, what are you looking at?
Sure.
Contamination.
We'll go into this a little bit further in depth, but contamination takes lots of different forms. It is, there are some types of plastic bottles, some plastics that are recyclable. There are a lot more kinds of plastics that are not recyclable. And they could be ambiguous, but things like hoses, other materials that are, other kinds of plastic resins that are not acceptable are examples of contamination. And I'll go more in depth into that in a few minutes. So contamination has impact on the actual environmental benefits of recycling. There are definitely times when it just does not make environmental sense to recycle in the first place. The economics and the energy it takes to get some material to the right place so that it can actually be turned into new materials ends up consuming more resources than if you would simply thrown it in the landfill and made something from scratch. It gets very complicated when you try to measure that. In general, when the way we measure the environmental benefits is looking at what we call life cycle analysis, where you look at all the different stages of how material is handled, from starting with virgin resources, when you have to find that, pull that material out of the ground, how much energy does it take to then refine bauxite minerals into aluminum, or to take oil, petroleum, and refine that, go through all the processes and turn that into a plastic. You measured that, the greenhouse gases that are emitted during that process. You also have to measure the process of then shipping it to where it's going to go. You have to measure the impact of actually remanufacturing new materials. Then it gets to your home. You consume it, you toss it in the recycling bin, and on the back end, you have to measure that impact as well. How much, what kind of emissions are generated by sending that recycling truck down the street, or sending the trash truck down the street, sending it to a recycling facility. Recycling generates, it requires energy, and it has a negative impact by itself. Where the benefit comes from is on two sides. On the downstream side, we refer to as the landfill. When you take it to a landfill or a waste to energy facility, you by not putting that material into the ground, you're not generating the methane that comes from the decomposing. When you take organic material and you bury it, it's going to decompose regardless, but when you do that without oxygen, instead of decomposing into carbon dioxide, it decomposes into methane, which we know to be 25–30% more intensive as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So by keeping it out of the landfill, you prevent that source of emissions. That's one side of it. Where the much greater impact comes from is upstream. It's when you look at where material is coming from to manufacture new items, and the ability for the scrap materials to displace virgin materials, which is where the real impact is that I'll come back to a little bit more. Talking about just some other aspects though of what is not working in the recycling industry, because it is not perfect. It's been pointed out that, and there are studies that have shown this, but we are a consumer society. We consume too much material, and we tend to think of recycling as being sort of a Band-Aid. Well, by doing this, I can feel a little bit better about buying things that I probably don't need to buy. And there's a definite dynamic that's been shown that influences people's thinking and causes people to buy things they otherwise would not, because they have the knowledge that I can recycle on the back end. There are a lot of the consumer product companies and the resource petroleum industries, others understand that, and they want to sell material. And so they definitely use recycling as a form of greenwashing to cover up the fact that they are encouraging people to consume things, I would say, on an irresponsible level. So those are all very real, tangible things, but none of that can negate the solid impact that comes from the fact that you are going to consume materials anyway. Those materials can be handled one way or another. It's a binary choice, and recycling is a more responsible way to do that, while acknowledging that we still need to address the consumption.
Sponsoring this.
So I've already talked a little bit about what's covered on this slide, but I want to focus in on, again, the real benefit of recycling is some of it comes from keeping it out of the landfill. The vast majority of the environmental benefit comes by not consuming virgin resources to make new items. By recycling it, you're putting it back into the system, and you're displacing the need for virgin materials. And I'll illustrate it in a moment how that works. There's a well-respected scientist in Oregon, David Alloway, who's done a lot of research into these life cycle analysis, studying exactly where the impact is. And this is, you can slice and dice greenhouse gas emissions and categorize them in many different ways, but I like the way he did it here, because he's pointing out, if you look at the orange block, material upstream, that's showing the greenhouse gas emissions that are created by producing things, by making this table, by making this screen, the clothes we wear. That material is the energy it takes to make these items, everything we consume. That is the greenhouse gas emissions as a percentage overall. You can see that's the largest category right there. When you look at the material downstream, that's a reference to the greenhouse gas emissions related to the landfill. It gives you a sense of how heavily it dwarfs it. The impact comes from consuming things, from what we buy and what we use. So this is another example, just on a much more granular level, looking at water, how we consume water. If you have two choices, let's narrow it down and say you can either buy it in a plastic bottle, single use, or you can get it out of a tap. When you look at the blue line, what that's showing is simply the overall greenhouse gas emission impact of buying a water bottle. Let's say that's 100% of the amount that you're generating. If you recycle that bottle, and let's say if we recycled 80% of all the plastic bottles that we generated, it would reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are generated down to this red line. Or it also has these other impacts on acidification, all these other impacts that come from industrial processes. So that's definitely better. We're having less of an impact with the red line when we recycle that plastic bottle. But what you can't even really see here is the fact that there is a third green line. And if you look really closely, it's right here. That is the environmental impact from simply using tap water. And so this starts to get to a sense of the impactfulness of what we can affect on a personal level through recycling versus what we consume on the front end. Yeah, you have a question?
As a part of advocacy to increase that green line, is there any truth to the fact that a lot of these bulk water companies, all it is tap water, it's not actually like coming from mineral springs? Have you heard anything about that in your profession?
Yeah, it's common knowledge that in most cases, the bottled water companies are simply drawing from municipal sources or from, in some cases, they're tapping directly into rivers and all, but a lot of it is coming just from municipal water sources.
Like tap water?
Yes.
Okay.
They take it through its own process to purify it and make it taste better and all, but yeah.
Gotcha.
So let's take that example and let's talk in another context. And this is where I want to step back and question the assumptions that we have about where actual environmental benefit comes from. So this is an example of a US EPA study where they looked at the different ways that you can package coffee. You could do it in a steel can, you could do it in a plastic can or plastic tub, or you can do it in one of these little plastic just wrap type of containers. This is an example of where recycling does not automatically mean it's better. To create a steel can takes a lot more resources than to create that plastic pouch, this flexible pouch. You look at the screen line, I don't know exactly what the metric is, but it's a 4.21 versus 1.14. So that's taking roughly a quarter of the amount of energy to make that plastic pouch as it does to make that steel can. And yet our intuition says that, well, steel cans are better because they can be recycled, whereas this plastic film pouch cannot be recycled. It's not recyclable. So the question is, as a consumer, how can you have a difference and how can you make an impact? It's not automatically the fact that it is recycled or that it's recyclable. It's also just about the sheer amount of material that's involved in creating that. So I think it's important to step back and not just think of these in simply black and white terms that recycling is all good, plastics are all bad. There are other reasons we may not want the plastic pouch, but I would argue in this instance that probably is the more environmentally responsible choice to make. With single-use plastics and plastic bags, we don't want to see those as an issue with marine debris, because that's a whole other source of negative impact. But this is an example where that's not an item that's likely to end up in the ocean. It's much different than things like straws or plastic cups, things that the way they get handled make them more susceptible to ending up as litter.
If we say it's not likely to end up in the land in the ocean from the United States. If it was sold in Indonesia, it was going in the ocean.
It's a good point. So a lot of this is also very controlled. It's very localized. It has to do with the waste management systems that you have in different locations. In the United States, the material that turns into litter that shows up in the street or in the gutter or that ends up in the waterways tends to be much more related to personal individual action. People simply being lazy or not disposing of things in the right way. If it gets into the proper waste management system, even if that means it's headed to a landfill, for the most part, that gets handled responsibly and it's not an issue ending up in waterways and in other negative areas. If you go to Southeast Asia and a lot of countries where they don't have an effective waste management system, it flips on its head. Yes, there's a lot of litter, but you also just have problems where dump trucks are just dumping it in giant piles on the side of a river. I know you know a lot about this in these conversations. So I'm going to keep moving along. Recycling is not a panacea. It's something. It's a responsible way of handling materials, but it does not by itself save the earth. And we need to move beyond the mentality of just thinking in simplistic terms like that. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these quickly, but showing examples of how we consume things is where we make the real impact. Recycling helps, but it's how we think about our purchasing decisions and what we do that have the biggest impact. We've heard a lot about, and we're all pretty familiar, I think, with the Sear Cup audience, with the problems with single-use plastics that get disposed. We want to avoid things like plastic bags, both because they consume a lot of materials, but also because these are much more likely to end up as litter and waterways. But that does not mean necessarily that the green alternative is automatically better. This is where we have to use, it's not a simplistic story, we have to use our judgment. It still requires energy to make these things. You don't actually help the environment by consuming something that is free. It simply has less of an impact, ideally, although not even in all instances. If you've ever found yourself at the store, you forgot your reusable bag, or maybe it's in the car, and you don't want to go back out there, but they're selling another bag at the counter, well, I'll just get that one, I'm still just doing something good. Well, not if you end up with having 15 or 20 bags that are all reusable, because to make a reusable bag consumes a lot more resources than a simple plastic bag. You have to use that hundreds of times before you actually get to the positive side of the environmental ledger. So again, consumption is not automatically the right thing. If you only drive 5,000 miles a year with an old gas engine car, it probably makes more sense to hold on to that car until you get the full life out of it than it is to rush out and buy an electric car that consumes a huge amount of resources. So it's important to, again, think through on that level. We have come to accept convenience as a God-given right, that we should not have to make any more effort than we possibly can to do anything. But this is another way that we have a huge impact by the material. We're consuming things we don't need to. I'm capable of cutting an avocado in half. It's not putting me out that much, but it's a lure that pulls us into it, and it's very easy to turn your brain off and just accept it. I can go on to Amazon's website, and their whole system is designed to make it so effortless to consume things that you just find yourself, sure, I'm going to buy this, do that, whatever. I have an old 50-year-old percolator that makes coffee just fantastically, does not require generating these little pods that are just waste. They're just going to end up consuming petroleum and going into the landfill. Consumption comes in many different forms. If you have an iPhone 12, you need an iPhone 14. We get this little dopamine hit when we buy a new gadget, a new toy, and that's, again, there's a strong lure to that, but this has a huge impact. This is where we make a difference. Fast fashion, we've all been hearing about, the idea that I wear it out once or twice and you throw it out, or maybe you donate it and you send it to Africa. That does not eliminate or begin to make up for the fact that it takes a huge amount of resources to make clothing in the first place. Buying just meaningless things that you might use a couple times and throw out, or the Christmas gag, the Thanksgiving gag, it's all great. Those consume resources for a laugh that will last for 2 minutes, and then we'll go in the closet, and eventually we'll show up in a Goodwill where it will get thrown out eventually.
What is that purple thing supposed to be?
I think it holds your page open somehow. Other ways, this is one where it's hugely frustrating, but the idea, we've moved to this whole concept of planned obsolescence, where a lot of consumer goods are made in a fashion that means that they are simply not going to last that long. In our house, we've had to replace a dryer that was only 5 years old, that worked perfectly well, except there was one small part in there that was going to require spending $500, and it costs just as much to buy it. Also, same thing, we replaced a printer recently. This one is for $85. It's cheap. That's fantastic. That's because it's cheap and it's going to break. So this is not something that we can easily control ourselves, because you can't buy durable things in a lot of cases. But we need to be conscious of this and finding opportunities where we can get feedback to manufacturers as we can. And then it's all just kind of boils down to this. We consume things, we fill our lives with stuff that we don't need to. And this all has a concrete impact that recycling, no amount of recycling can ever begin to undo the environmental impact that comes from simply filling our lives with stuff. How are we doing for time?
We're doing okay, but we have 27 questions.
Oh, we have black horses. Okay. Let me,
Are you also taking questions from people at home?
yes.
We will after the
We will.
presentation.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do a couple more slides and then we'll pause here and we'll dive into questions and we'll start talking about this what can be recycled. Food is a whole nother issue that we need to focus a lot more of our energy on. Because I think it's tended to be a sleeper issue, but it takes a lot of resources to make food. The fertilizers require a lot of petroleum, the whole process of growing items, that consumes a huge amount of resources, and we are just as wasteful in this country when it comes to food as we are with real goods. As you can see with these stats here, 40% of everything, all food we generate ends up in the landfill. And that should be shocking. And that, don't forget, when it gets into the landfill, it's turning into methane. So it's having an impact on both ends. We need to do a lot more to reduce what we consume. There are a number of really good resources that are out there. US EPA has a whole campaign they've been doing around encouraging people to just getting restaurants and others to donate unserved portions that are still edible to food shelters. There's a lot on a personal level. This website here was put together by the National Resource Defense Council, safefood.com. This has a lot of practical tips for just in your own home, how you can come up with techniques so that you're not getting items that get to the back of your refrigerator and you get forgotten about until it's time to throw them out. A lot of tips about how you can reduce your waste and also save money on the front end by not purchasing things that you're going to consume. So the last thing I want to go over is just getting each of us to make a commitment of what we can do. My goal with all this has not been to create a sense of guilt or that to say that we all need to become pure, go live in a yurt in the mountains because that's the only way that we can possibly fit. No, that's not the idea. We need to be cautious of how we consume. We need to be mindful and just remind ourselves when we're buying things and not just lull ourselves back into this sense of complacency of I'm going to recycle it, so I don't need to worry about it. It's going to be okay in the end. So I would encourage each one of you to just in your own mind, for yourself, make a commitment. What is something that you do at home that you can think, I can change this? And make that commitment to yourself as something that you can follow up with. Let's talk about, let's dive into what's recyclable. This gets even more convoluted and it goes into a deep well, but on the very surface, something that's important to know is that anything is recyclable in theory, but nothing is recyclable unless there's a market that can actually take it. Somebody who's willing to take that material and economically be able to turn it into a new thing. And there are a lot of different things that influence that. It's economic, obviously. You've got to have the value of the material has to be high enough that it creates the ability to pay for the whole collection system. A lot of it's technological. When Christine was showing the video earlier of the new recycling facility, you saw all those gears moving things around. Things have to be able to get through that automated system. If you think back to those little coffee pods that I was showing, the material is very recyclable. It's a valuable material. It's a polypropylene, I believe. But those things are too small to get through the system. It falls directly through the gears. And so it may be recyclable in theory, but if it can't get through the mechanical process, it effectively becomes unrecyclable. And so when you have the question in your mind of why can't this be recycled, or why in this community can I recycle it, but my sister in Des Moines, Iowa, she can't take it. It's because a lot of this is very localized. You might have a recycling facility that can take certain materials in Des Moines that you simply don't have here. And so it gives you sort of a high level understanding of why things are as complex as they are. But Christine, why don't you come up here and just talk about it here in Charleston County at least?
So yes, and I'll be quick with this too. So with the plastics, it's so important to really only include standard plastic bottles and containers. Think items you would buy in a grocery store. If it's a one-off plastic item, the chances of it getting stuck in that sorting process in the machines is pretty high. So we want to really avoid things like bulky plastics, like laundry hampers, kids' toys, PVC pipes. Anything that we refer to as tanglers, which a lot of times come in a plastic form, like cords, cables, PVC pipes, things like that. We really just want to stick to those standard plastic bottles and containers. That leads me into our number one contaminant that we see at the recycling center, which is what we call flexible plastic film, plastic bags, Ziploc bags, plastic wrap, grocery bags, anything, any type of plastic that you can take and crinkle up in your hand is going to cause huge processing issues for us at the recycling center. You can see in this photo, the workers, having to crawl in the machines and physically cut out the plastic wrap that is wrapped around those rotors that help sort the equipment. That's the reality of a recycling center where, contamination with unaccepted items are entering it. Those shutdowns are costly. Sometimes they happen a couple times a day. So leaving items like plastic bags out of your cart is of most important. Also, another thing is we don't accept items bagged in plastic bags in the recycling cart for that same reason. We want everything loose in the cart, no bags.
But this is all very recyclable material. The actual
Exactly.
material itself has a high value. It just has to get into the system the correct way.
That's absolutely correct. When it's source separated and it's clean and it's dry, that's why grocery stores are able to accept plastic bags, because they send it directly to a processing facility where it's shredded down and made into a new recycled content item. Unfortunately, with our program being single stream, all the items being mixed together, we don't have that clean, dry quality, to be able to accept plastic bags. And also the processing system that we have just does not allow for plastic bags to be an accepted item.
Someone online wants to know what to do with the plastic bags.
Grocery and retail.
Repeat that.
Yes, so grocery and retail stores are a fantastic option for your plastic bags, your bread bags, plastic wrap. Reuse them wherever you can. We always, encourage that as well.
The material itself is usually an HDPE, which is it's the same resin type as a milk jug, but it's processed in a different form. But that material can be used. You see it oftentimes with recycled lumber. It's made out of the kind of plastic that comes from film. As an example of what that specifically gets turned into.
So another item that is certainly accepted in Charleston County's recycling program is any fiber-based item other than shredded paper. So anything that is made from regular paper, paperboard, corrugated cardboard, as long as it's flattened, can go inside your recycling cart. The big takeaway with corrugated cardboard is to make sure to remove any unaccepted material like the plastic wrap, the styrofoam, things like that that are not accepted in the program and can end up in the recycling center as contamination.
So I have a question for you. This is where you can do this for 30 years and still end up with questions. I know it used to be, we would say if paper came into contact with food in some way, that was kind of a rule that said it's not recyclable. And the theory is that there's a thin plastic barrier on that paper so that it doesn't absorb the moisture from the food. And that used to mean that it was not recyclable. Is that still the case? Or?
Well, we always say if it's soiled and if it's enough to be icky, gross, don't put it in the recycling cart. It's going to create bugs for you. It's likely not going to be processed through in the recycling center. So if it is soiled, food contaminated, the best thing to do is to put it in either a composting system or to throw it in the garbage. I should probably mention pizza boxes because I'm sure people will bring that up. We get asked about pizza boxes all the time, and it's National Pizza Month, so we can talk about that. But pizza boxes, in a general sense, are recyclable. So I always tell people, use your best judgment when it comes to the pizza box. You can always rip the top of the lid off the pizza box. That's generally always going to be non-food soiled, clean. If the bottom is, just has some crumbs in it, maybe you've gotten a really thin crust, sort of healthy pizza, then the entire pizza box can go into recycling. However, if it's food contaminated, cheese, oil, all that gunk on the bottom of the pizza box, Again, just rip the lid off, you can recycle that part and then throw the food contaminated bottom part of the pizza box into the garbage. Or shred it up and compost it.
What about just regular like printing paper?
I'm sorry?
Printing paper is regular 8 by 11, whatever paper that is.
Oh, that's absolutely accepted, yes.
May I ask you a question?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So how clean does plastic need to be? Because you talk about contamination, which so far I'm thinking has been with non-recyclable materials. But, you know, if you get things too clean, then you're using a lot of water and wasting the water to get it clean. And it's kind of a trade-off.
It is, yeah. I mean, we have a sort of threshold that we try to stay under with each bale with kind of food, soils, items in there. That's all handled by our processor. But in a general sense, we don't want you to waste time, energy, water, money rinsing out your recyclables. Give them a quick rinse, and generally that's good enough. If it's something like a mayonnaise jar or a peanut butter jar, maybe just squirt some dish soap, hot water, let it sit overnight, give it a quick rinse. That'll be good enough for our program here in Charleston County. I can't speak for every program, but we do want the material to be as clean as possible, because while we do have a lot of automation in our recycling center, we also have a lot of people who are touching these items. We have the QC guys at the beginning of the line that you saw, and we always have QC people at the end of each sort of sorting station. So if you don't want to touch it, they likely don't want to either. So you can give it a quick rinse. That's going to be just fine.
I started out my career as working at a recycling center when I was in college. I'm excited to get it because it is kind of a humanitarian thing. When it's hot out there, it's pretty unpleasant. Making sure that you got the big globules of food and the obvious gunk out is important, but it's not necessary to have it spit clean. You know, it doesn't have to be absolutely pure.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Thank you.
Ultimately, it is going into an industrial process, and to the point you made, you don't want to be consuming more resources than you need to, just to get it to a point where it can actually be recycled.
I've got a question. Okay, apparently, England or the UK, whatever you want to call it, now has a company, an environmental company, I think it's System Environmental or something like that. And they manage to make plastics that are degradable. And when are they going to start putting that into using that material for these plastics that we have that aren't degradable?
So yeah, thank you. This is like a softball question you just handed me. This actually goes back to a point that I was making a few slides back about questioning the assumption of what seems to be the environmental choice versus what actually has a tangible impact. We want to encourage composting. It's hugely important. And we also don't want to have plastics that get into the waterways and break down into microplastics and have those problems. So in theory, degradable plastics or compostable plastics are a positive thing. They sound positive. It's decomposing into earth. The problem is how our actual processes work. So if you step back and remember the point I was making earlier, that where we have the biggest impact on the environment is not necessarily downstream, what happens to it at the back end. You know, there's some impact putting it into a landfill, definite impact when it creates litter or goes in the green environment. The big impact is when we consume things. It's all the energy it takes to make that, let's say it's a cup. And so then if you keep that in mind, you don't have the choice of, do you have a cup that is made out of a plastic that is not degradable, it's recyclable. If it ends up in the wrong place, it becomes a real problem. Or you can have a compostable cup, or you can have something that is degradable that can be composted in theory. When you make that degradable, you can turn it into soil in the ground in theory, but a plastic cup doesn't have real nutrients. It doesn't really contribute anything as a material. The embodied energy, the resources that went into creating that, you more or less are just losing when you compost it. Versus if it gets recycled, if that cup gets turned into a new plastic cup, it then displaces the need for the virgin material to create that new cup. And so that embodied energy is captured and it's able to go back in the system, and it prevents the need for all the emissions, all the negative environmental impact from drilling more oil and creating that in the first place. So it gets murky when you get into this world. There are definitely contexts and reasons why compostable dinnerware makes sense, but it's not an automatic slam dunk assumption. Sorry, if you're coming here hoping to have things clarified and made nice and crystal clean, and here's what we do. Unfortunately, it just is very complicated. One of the biggest problems we have in this country is that there's a big disconnect between manufacturers, the companies that make and sell things, and those of us on the back end who are trying to manage what to do with that. A lot more can be done to make things designed to be easier to recycle, that they would reduce the amount of effort and energy that's taken to recycle it, and also just to reduce the amount of packaging in the first place. But the costs of the downstream managing that waste is not factored into the decision making when those companies design those items. They don't have to pay those costs, and so it's somebody else's problem. Okay.
At the aquarium, we're working very hard to green our events. We have a lot of events there, big companies rent it out. I mean, we'll have as many as 500, 600, 700 people in an event. So when you have a bar and there are wine glasses and beer cans and bottles, there are lots of materials. So we're trying to go to compost. You can't have dishware for that many people, right? So we're trying to get the best products that are compostable. But compostables take energy to produce. So if you can just take a can, right, that's better than pouring a can into a compostable cup. But then you need to have recycling and trash, or recycling and compost there. You can't get 500 people to do that properly. And we don't have the manpower to man stations, right? So the idea that we're tossing around is, do we put every drink into a compostable cup so that every single thing that people have can go into compost and go to smart compost, right?
Yep.
Because if they put cans and bottles into the compost, it's getting scrapped.
Right.
They're not going to go through that and weed out that,
It would ruin all the good stuff.
it would ruin the good stuff. So it's so hard because we know that how much energy it's going to take to produce 2 drinks per person for 500 people or whatever, right? I mean, do you agree that that's probably the best?
We should talk on the side. This is the whole deep.
There are a lot of details.
So I've spoken at 3 different recycling specific conferences over the last month and a half. And when I talk to that audience, the people who manage and set up programs, we talk a lot about how do you design your system and your infrastructure anticipating behavior.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make it easy and seamless so that people don't have to have that PhD in recycling,
Right.
that they just instinctively do it. And that's kind of where you're going at, is how you do that.
We've stood there and asked people, I mean, clear signs, and people just, they won't, they're just not going to think about it.
Let's talk more on this.
Yeah.
I want to take some questions we have that have come into the chat.
All right, so getting some of these questions from the chat. All right, can the MRF handle 600, or if the MRF can handle 600 tons a day, how much do you collect per day on average?
We generally get about 250 tons coming in each day, dependent on a lot of different factors, but that's the average. Okay.
So you have a lot of capacity still.
Oh yeah, there's capacity for a second shift and more tonnage. It was really, I mean, it truly was constructed as a regional facility. I think, it will over time become more of that.
So there's a question about the recycling triangles. Is there a list of undesirable things that are labeled with the triangle, and are the numbers useful for that purpose?
Yes, so this goes to the point I was just making a moment ago about how the people who manufacture, design things, and sell it don't talk to or coordinate with people on the back end who are trying to manage that. So if you take, it's like the classic example is a plastic bottle where it has that little triangle on the bottom side of it and has a little number in that. That number has, that symbol and that number have nothing to do with recycling. It was not put on there to have anything to do with recycling. That was put on by the plastic industry. It's simply their own way of coding things for their own knowledge. But the whole world assumes that has to do with recyclability because it has a little recycling triangle on it.
Yeah.
And so if you wonder why you get confused about it, it's because of these sort of just weird issues.
And then, no, I mean, I was just gonna agree with that. You know, we've changed our education to get away from the resin numbers on the bottom of plastic items, because again, like Alex said, they don't speak to an item's recyclability at all. We've changed our education to just say plastic bottles and containers, doesn't matter what number is on the bottom. It just gets so convoluted because there are items that we can't accept, that we can't recycle, things like, you know, the thicker plastic bags that have the little recycling symbol with a number on them on the bottom. We don't want those, we can't take those. So we don't even speak to the numbers. They're just resin codes. They're just identifiers for the plastics industry.
There's a level that we are not going to fill in more details because nobody's humanly capable of juggling all these. We have to sort of put these guardrails on, even with the definition of like this, where, you know, make sure it's a rigid container, it's prepared for food. If you simplify it to that, there may be some things that are not recyclable that fit this definition, but they're small enough that you don't need to worry about it because it's just not a big enough issue. It's much more of an issue if we try to open it up and get into more granular level where it only becomes this big murky harassment.
So Christina, what percentage of items that are collected, those items that can actually be recycled, are recycled into the products from Johnson?
So all of the items that make it through the processing at our facility, they're baled into bales. All those bales are sold to remanufacturers. So if it's a recyclable item, it is being sold to a remanufacturer. If it's an item that's not accepted, it's likely being landfilled.
So 100% of what comes to you that is
I
recyclable.
don't want to say 100%, but the vast majority.
Okay.
Obviously, there, you know, things could happen during processing, like a fire. I mean, who knows, you know. I don't want to say 100%, but the vast majority of items that are accepted in the program as recyclable are being shipped off to the manufacturers as we made into items.
But one exception I would make to what you're saying goes back to another point from earlier on, though, is contamination. It's not just the item itself that does not belong in there that has to be pulled out and thrown out. Those contaminants can also contaminate other materials. And so stuff that is very recyclable that gets to the recycling facility, take paper that's now been covered up with spaghetti sauce, that can't be recycled. And so there's always some percentage of that happening in a recycling facility. And one of the reasons it's so important to reduce contamination, I feel like it's like we keep hitting this point.
It feels
This is
redundant,
really
but
important.
it is truly so important because it's, you know, one bad apple can spoil the entire bunch. There are frequently times where a load of, you know, an entire truckload of items gets dumped on the tipping board. Unfortunately, the level of contamination is so high that that entire truckload, likely, you know, mostly good recyclable items, has to go to the landfill because there's just no possible way to sort through all the bad stuff and get to the good stuff.
I have a question, if you don't mind. I've had my hand raised here because I don't know how else to do this. I don't know if people are looking at the reaction section, you know, where you can raise your hand. I'll be very quick here. You said something about recycling plastic or composting plastic cups. I have not seen any literature that says that most of compostable cups actually get composted. And I think, I don't know if we're using different definitions for composting, but just because it deteriorates doesn't mean that that's good, you know? And so we have a lot of cups that are turning into microplastics. And I don't know if you're calling that composting. And the other thing is you actually do need to add virgin plastic to recyclable plastics for most reuses. If you're going to reuse a cup and make more cups, you have to add more chemicals. So I'm wondering if you would address those two questions. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, to step back at one point, you can make plastics out of petroleum, obviously. You can also make plastics from vegetable material. There's two different ways that you can make it. It's all coming from organic materials, just some of it's been in the ground for several billion years. In that process, you can design it so that it breaks down and it actually does not turn into microplastics. It actually breaks down in the proper composting facility with the proper conditions to the point where it does decompose and it goes away. But there are, again, a lot of caveats to that. It's got to be a facility that's actually built for it. It has to generate a lot of heat to break it down. If you don't have those ideal conditions, if you don't have that heat, it will kind of sort of break down, but then it's kind of like having other kind of plastic that's still sitting there. It doesn't actually break down.
Yeah, you're right. And so you're talking about the industrial composting facilities, which we don't have enough of to cover all the plastic composting cups that we've got. Okay, thank you for that. And the other issue.
Remind me, the other question was.
In recycling plastics, especially in foodware, you have to add additional chemicals or more processes. Sometimes you have to add virgin plastic to get it to behave. Can you address that?
Yeah. So with many different types of materials, there is a certain level of attrition. The number of times something gets recycled, there's some degrading and loss of material. Now, the quality is not always the same level as creating a virgin material. You see that mostly with paper. For paper to hold together, you have gazillions of different fibers that have to hold together. Every time you mechanically break down that paper, shred it up, go through the whole recycling process, it shortens those fibers so that it doesn't have the same quality. And so you have to introduce a certain percentage to make a new product. You always have to have a certain percentage of new virgin paper fiber just to give it the structural integrity to work. And that also applies to plastic on a certain level. Like, this is getting deeper into the knowledge level than I have, but that is accurate, that there is some level of virgin material that's needed to make new plastic bottles even with recycled.
Okay, there's another question from online. Havatal, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so I have a comment and a question. So I love it, and I can't be more sarcastic when Americans think that China or other countries need to take our garbage. First of all, they don't have to. It is our garbage. It's our responsibility, not to mention the fact that there's the carbon footprint of shipping it to China or any other country. We manufacture more garbage than any other country in the world. Canada just surpassed us. It's our responsibility to stop that. So that was my comment. And then I recommended two movies that I highly recommend: Tapped, about bottled water, and The Story about Plastic, about recycling and how it's handled in different parts of the world. My question is, why doesn't the Sierra Club lobby the state of South Carolina to charge 5 or 10 cents? Like, I believe there are 10 states that do that for bottles and cans. It brings money to the state and it's recyclable. You know, the people have an incentive to go and recycle. And if not, I came from Connecticut. There are a lot of homeless people that will actually go and collect cans and bottles, and they get their 5 cents, but they come with these huge bags of bottles and cans. They make a little bit of money and they clean up, and it helps everybody. Why isn't the Sierra Club lobbying the state of South Carolina to charge a bottle deposit?
So I can answer that question for you. So that has been lobbied in the past. That has been, different groups, various environmentalists have tried to get that done. The issue in the South, especially in Atlanta, South Carolina, North Carolina, is we are the bottling states. Coke and Pepsi are in Atlanta and North Carolina. That's their home base. So They lobby harder than everyone else to keep that from happening. So it's just not going to happen in our neck of the woods. And that's why. All right.
For the beverage manufacturers, there's a certain cost to them for recycling systems. And at the end of the day, they like having the public sector take that cost. They can externalize the end of life for their materials. And so municipal, county governments are paying the cost to handle their material, but they lobby aggressively against bottle deposit laws because the perception that it increases the cost of buying a bottle in the first place and that will depress their sales. That's an oversimplification of the issue. But you have those laws in 10 states now, and South Carolina is just for political reality not going to be joining that list anytime in the near future.
Can you recycle?
Well, then maybe, can I say something as a follow-up? So in Europe, they actually charge the manufacturers for every single bottle of plastic. Why can't we lobby them to, and it's not only for drinking, it's for shampoo, for anything. Then why not try to lobby that way and say, hey, they're doing it in Europe?
There are a lot of things to lobby about. You have to prioritize based on what you think and as a political viability. What can you actually impact and put your resources and your effort towards what you could achieve would be the simple answer.
So this question is, if you have a bottle and it's been recycled once, can it be recycled again?
Yes.
Pretty much already.
Meaning it's made from recycled content?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michelle Key, did you have another question?
Yes, I did. And it's for you, Christine. You told me a few years ago, and I was so thankful for it. And I wanted to circle back and see if this still holds true, that we could recycle those crinkly plastic things, like a cereal box liner, with the, not in the recyclable bin, but with the film plastics. Is that still true? Like with the plastic bags?
So it honestly just depends on the individual retail or grocery store that you're talking about. I would just double check with the one that you plan on utilizing, because all I can really speak to is our program, and we can't accept that plastic film.
But to your question, Michelle, go to plasticfilmrecycling.org, and that's an industry website that's set up that explains film plastics and what kinds of film plastics are acceptable in those supermarket systems. But the short answer is the bag that comes from a cereal box, that is recyclable. That's okay. Bread bags are okay. Shrink wrap is generally okay. It comes on big packages, not saran wrap. Saran wrap is not acceptable. The wrappers around a big toilet paper roll, that's okay. So maybe.
And look for plastics that have a number 2 or number 4 on them if they're film.
Yeah. But if it's down, go to plasticfilmrecycling.org and you can find a more exhaustive list.
And those go to the grocery store, not the recycling, not in the blue parts.
Carol, did you have a question?
Sorry, you're echoing, Christine. I couldn't hear you. It echoes.
Just no plastic film in the blue parts, and just make sure you check out the plasticfilmrecycling.org website for places to correct the recycled film.
Oh, okay, thank you. Because you know what, there's the cereal box things, you say it's recyclable, but there's no place in Columbia to send it to, so.
It can go with your plastic bags to any, if there's a supermarket that takes plastic bags, it can go in there.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
You have that page that shows all the plastic bottles and things that can be recycled, and I noticed the little tops. Do those go in, because you were saying like the carrot things can't be, but the caps and the tops.
I do ask that question.
Bottle or the screw on.
So to repeat the question, can the caps on plastic bottles, are they recyclable? This is another example of where the complexity of recycling, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, we would have said no, because they actually are made out of different plastic resin type than the bottle itself. The other problem is that the equipment that used to be in these recycling facilities 20 years ago was a lot lower tech. And you would throw in a bottle in there and create this little air bubble that the balers could not actually compact. They weren't strong enough to do it. And so that was a mechanical problem. The equipment is much more powerful now. It just has no problem crushing that. So we don't worry about that problem. And when it gets to the recycling facilities, they've got filtering technology that can pull out those different resin types and separate them on the back end so that the plastic caps should stay on the bottle. They will only get recycled if they stay screwed onto the top. If they're just loose, tossed into the bin, they are like those little Keurig cups. It will just fall through the cracks.
Well, what about a plastic toss like on a glass peanut butter jar?
That's okay. You can leave those on because they'll get pulled out by the magnet and the glass will still be recyclable. The metal jar lid itself might not get recycled, but we just say leave it on.
To the plastic one will.
Yes,
Should leave it
right,
on.
that's correct.
Those two things.
If I could point out another thing about the mechanical aspects of how a MRF material recovery facility mechanically handles materials and that has sort of changed the equation from what you might have thought of 20 years ago. You know, we used to compact, you have a little can crusher, you collect them together. And that's great if that can is going directly to a metal recycler that is able to take sorted with only aluminum cans, and then it all goes into the facility, it gets smelted and turned into new cans. But when that flattened can or plastic bottle shows up in a MRF, it's going through a mechanical process where you have equipment that's designed to separate material based on its physical properties. And when something is flattened, it has the same physical properties as paper. And so it tends to get blowed and sorted over to that side. It has to be three-dimensional to have the physics of how it bounces around for it to get separated over into.
Have you seen that at the Charleston County?
Oh, yes, we definitely encourage everyone to leave the item in its original shape. No crushing.
If you crush your cans, you can take it to Charleston Metal and you can sell it back for money, and that's fine.
It does create processing issues. The machines see it paper.
So, yeah, another question?
I just have two questions left. My first question is basically the price of plastic is extremely cheap, basically free at grocery stores. Plastic bags are free. Doesn't cost us anything. Plastic bottles. So my question is like, plastic is derived from they mine for petroleum and rises up as big smokestacks via heat and it's separated into different fuel, different grades of petroleum as it rises up to smokestacks. Excuse me. So if everyone was recycling their plastic, don't we produce so much petroleum for gasoline and diesel as this anyway that let's see, more people recycling of excess virgin plastic should be produced by these petroleum refineries. We have excess left over. You know what I'm saying?
I'm sorry, will you repeat the question because we can't hear it? Thank you.
It's hard to explain. Maybe you know what I'm saying.
So I don't know the answer to this very well, but the basic question is the petroleum you draw out of the ground and use that to make a plastic bottle, or you refine that into gasoline. It goes through different processes that turn it into different.
Is it
materials.
or is it gasoline or plastic, or is it just like you get gasoline plus you get the virgin plastic material in addition? So you say two.
I think there's hundreds of products you can make out of oil.
This is, you need to have somebody actually knows the chemistry of this better than I do. But my understanding is there are different, you separate petroleum and there are different elements and there's some portions of that are suitable to be made into things like plastics that are not suitable necessarily to be turned into fuel.
I see an excess virgin plastic material. Everyone will recycle it. What are you gonna do with that?
So he's asking everyone if there's extra chemicals that won't be used if we don't create plastic. And I just don't think that's true. I think that you can make oil into several different types of fuel, number one. Loading, cars, and parts on planes, you name it. It can go into it. So it doesn't have to go into a plastic bottle. It could go into a lot of other things.
And I think this one's quicker. is, what about the chemicals used for processing, recycling materials? Does that create an environmental hazard at all, toxic or hazardous at all?
Certainly, recyclables are going into an industrial process, and industrial processes involve chemicals, they involve emissions. All that happens with turning recyclable scrap materials into new feedstock. But I'm talking in a very broad brush, it's much less so than taking virgin resources. When you take petroleum, the steps to process that into a plastic bottle are much more involved. There are more steps involved. There's more chemistry involved. There's a lot more opportunities to create emissions and toxic byproducts when you're working from virgin feedstock than if you're working from recycled scrap materials. Same thing with aluminum cans. One reason that aluminum is considered so recyclable, the stat is that it takes 5% the amount of energy to make a new can out of an old can as it does to mine bauxite out of the ground and go through all those processes. There's chemistry involved with all that. Toxic byproducts, there's less of it when it's a simpler process.
So we're gonna try to wrap it up.
I
So
just want to answer.
we're wrapping it up now. We're gonna cut off the questions. So Alec and Christina, can you just give us a wrap up? What's like the final thing you want to say?
Yeah, that's definitely a great summary because of, all of the issues with contamination. If you're wondering if it should go in the cart or not, just don't put it in there. Don't put it in your recycling cart. Just try to find another use for it or throw it out. The
Okay,
biggie for me.
Yeah. Thank you. Feel free, if you have more questions, both those are available, there are emails to answer questions outside of this meeting.
And thank you everyone online and everyone who came
Great
tonight. I
questions.
appreciate
Thanks,
you all. Hope we answered as many of your questions as possible. And reduce and reuse and then recycle. All right.
That should have been my one.
Thank you. That was a great program. Enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.